Welcome back to another deep dive where we're sitting down with Dr. Tony Attwood exploring specific subjects, and this one is personal to Dr. Tony, and it's also personal to many of you in the viewing audience. It's about addiction, it's about depression, and unfortunately in some cases it's about jail. Dr. Tony, this is a question that was submitted the other day, and it touched me deeply because I know this has been something that's touched you. I need guidance for my 20-year-old son. Luke has been different his entire life. He's very bright, but he struggles with social issues, anxiety, and depression. He joined the Air Force, and he did very well academically, but he self-medicated, and he medicated with something that he got off the internet. He had a mental breakdown, and he was then discharged. He now has problems living with us at home, including self-harm, abusing alcohol. I sent him to a rehab program, but it didn't help. He's been hospitalized in a psychiatric unit, also of no help. He's currently taking Zoloft and he's on other meds, but no help. And I'm desperate. My son is sinking further into despair. He frequently expresses a desire to kill himself, and he hopes that he will get cancer just so he doesn't have to keep on living. My son is an amazing person, but I feel so helpless. I truly don't know where to turn. I'm writing this letter hoping that you have something for me, a desperate mom.
She is desperate, but she's not alone. There are many situations where once I broach the subject, say at a presentation, I watch the audience and the number of people who say, yeah, that may be describing someone with ASD or a family member with the possibility of ASD. Now, in addiction, there are a number of pathways, because addiction is not necessarily for drugs, it's also computer games. And that's another topic which we may well go through. But looking at the pathways, often addiction is to engage or disengage socially. If you are socially unsure and anxious, alcohol and marijuana at low level are relaxants. And it means that when you take a little bit of alcohol or marijuana, you feel, I can cope with it, I can engage. But you can also then engage with a particular group of people who consume various substances that have a broad definition of normality, are not necessarily derogatory, and may accept you, especially if you're carrying drugs, or to sell you drugs. So you can engage in a culture that has its own language, routine, rules, etc. It's your alternative family to a certain extent. But another reason to take drugs is to disengage. That is to create a bubble of, I don't care, I don't remember. So the things that you're worried about, it's a thought blocker. It allows you to become detached from your problems. And with my son Will, who's an addict, he said, I had all these racing thoughts, but alcohol and morphine slowed them down. And no other prescription medication has been able to slow down my rapidly accelerating anxious thoughts. So there are many reasons why someone can initially start on a path, and once they're on that path, the intoxication can be incredibly powerful, knowing that this is a way of coping with life. But the difficulty can be the range of substances the person may take and the damaging effect. For example, those with ASD need their frontal lobes. It's the planning, it's the organizing, it's the having to think, what do I say, what do I do, etc. Those with ASD really need fully functioning frontal lobes. But when I did my clinical training, there was a wonderful phrase, the frontal lobes are soluble in alcohol. Or if you're Freudian trained, the superego dissolves in alcohol. And so there are lots of subsequent consequences in terms of the ASD characteristics and daily living skills. And one of the first casualties in addiction to a family is truth, which goes. So the person you used to know has gone. They become this other person. Now, it may be a condition that has a use-by date for many neurotypicals, but for those with ASD, it tends to go deeper and longer. And what concerns me is the rehab services have not come to terms with autism. The current research suggests that 1 in 4 of those in a rehab center have an autism spectrum disorder. And when my son, Will, went into rehab, he couldn't cope with the group disclosure, identifying, empathizing, being in tune with other people, avidly listening to their stories. He really went through this in a solitary way. He was not a group person. And so he was viewed as non-compliant. He won't do what we're suggesting. And he found that the lifestyle and circumstances really didn't acknowledge his ASD characteristics. What I'd like to do one day is have rehab units for ASD people with staff there that know it. And often I find for those with ASD, when they come off a drug, they choose it. Mm-hmm. They say, right, that's it. I can't cope with this anymore. I will do it. And they go, no detox. They just stop it and can do that. So from my point of view, it's a characteristic that leads to all sorts of problems. To a certain extent, it can, for the males, lead to criminal activities, which is what happened with my son, and to get money for ice. And ice, wow. A part of ASD can be a lack of inner self. Who am I? I'm fragmented. I'm not confident. I just feel weak in a variety of ways. But when you're on amphetamines, and ice in particular, you're a lion. You're powerful. You can do it. And that becomes incredibly intoxicating for that individual. Mm-hmm. They suddenly have a self-belief, an omnipotence, which is incredibly intoxicating. Mm-hmm. But it is incredibly dangerous in its addiction. Mm-hmm. So addiction will also occur with another characteristic, and that is computer games. And in computer games, as much as I said one of the characteristics is to detach, the computer games enable you to detach from reality. You enter another reality. It's a thought blocker for anxiety. So when you're playing Minecraft, all your anxious thoughts are blocked. The trouble is, the moment you switch Minecraft off, they're back. It doesn't dissolve them, but it blocks them. And so you also have someone who's not only anxious but potentially depressed. Sometimes the depression is not only low self-esteem, but it's also mental exhaustion from coping with life, energy depletion. And the game infuses you with a huge amount of excitement and energy through adrenaline. You have a sense of status in that group, because if you're playing group games, there are those who value you. You are the person to join up with because you are an expert in the game. So it gives you status, it gives you self-esteem. So for that individual, it's who I am. It stops me being depressed or anxious. It's a lifestyle that is where I'm respected, valued in the game. I'm a superhero. I'm fantastic. Reality doesn't accept me. So I'm going to escape into the game indefinitely. And we lose them into the game. And the games are actually designed to be addictive. Mm-hmm. And once they're in the game, it has many parallels to heroin. If you're in another world, and if you're interrupted from that world, as heroin addicts, if you actually interrupt them and get them to do things, suddenly become incredibly aggressive. You're supposed to be tranquil and calm? No. That's why opium dens are quiet, tranquil places where nobody moves, because if they do, they get their head bitten off. So in many ways, when some teenagers are starting on computer games, it's like giving them heroin. And I'm concerned about that. So it needs to be explored with the person as to why it's potentially dangerous. To go through with them that there needs to be controlled access. That what would be a reasonable amount of time, 2 hours a day, Okay. Beyond that, it's starting to take over your life. But you also have to make sure that they have a life. They have an alternative. An opportunity to resolve and have closure with the problems of the past that they ruminate on, but they can escape into the games and that's gone. But it's also to have social contacts and a quality of life that means you no longer need to do that. But also you have effective treatment for anxiety and depression, psychologically and hopefully by, if you're going to use drugs, prescription drugs that are carefully monitored. So this is becoming an increasing modern phenomenon with the access of drugs. So Will began when he was about 14, 15 years old, associating with a crowd that was experimenting with drugs. They all experimented and after a year or two, gone. But he didn't do that. And those with ASD very rarely do things by half measures. And when they do it, they really do it. And this can be so despairing for the individual because they can't imagine life without the drugs. And so there's a resistance to any suggestion because if you say no drugs, how am I going to cope? I'm not going back to what I was like when I was 16. No way. I have to have this to survive. Mm-hmm. So you need to work with that person about creating an appropriate life and have people in alcohol and drug dependency services who speak Aspergerese. And one of the things that I think is very important is an Asperger mentor. And this is where my hope is for my son, William, who's still an addict at 36, to one day be a mentor for others because he knows, he understands, he's been there, he has credibility. And I think if anybody's going to give the motivation, it's going to be Will, but he's still on the journey.
Mm-hmm. So what I'm hearing you say is there is no easy solution to this at this point. It's identification of the addiction, acknowledgement of the addiction, and working to bring that person, be they an adult or a child, back to reality and actually the good of reality versus what's depressed them,
yes,
that push them toward addiction, but it's an ongoing thing.
Yeah, it's hard work. And it requires motivation from the person concerned, and that's difficult to achieve. And they need positive feedback in moving in that direction. But a team of people to support them. Often with addiction, it's one of the greatest stresses on families, and sometimes the families abandon that person. We've never abandoned Will. He still lives with us. So it is bringing people together. And in the question you got there is someone who thinks, what's the point of life? The risk is overdose and deciding that's my way out. Because one of the side effects of many of those drugs is actually depression. They are depressants, and they will make depression greater. And so there is a genuine risk of suicide and death by misadventure. For Will, a number of his friends, some of whom had ASD, had because they're dead. They died young. Sometimes with fentanyl as an accidental overdose. Sometimes they say, that's it, I'm out of here, I'm just going to inject more than usual because that's the best way to die.
So in summary, to the mom that wrote the letter, there is no easy way out, but you are not alone. There are other people that are trying to find solutions. And the best you can do is love your kid and help your kid as much as possible, because that sounds like what you have done with Will.
Yeah.